This episode is supported in part by Sacred Wright's public scholarship on religion, gender, and sexuality through a grant from the E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Foundation. You can find Sacred Wrights online at sacred-rights.org and the Carpenter Foundation at carpenterfoundation.us. Welcome to Classical Ideas. This is Greg Soden. On this episode, I am delighted to welcome Dr. Lucas Wilson. Formerly the Justice, Equity, and Transformation Postdoctoral Fellow at University of Calgary, Lucas is a Postdoctoral Fellow at University of Toronto Mississauga. He is the author of At Home with the Holocaust, Postmemory, Domestic Space, and Second-Generation Holocaust Narratives from Rutgers University Press. He is also the editor of Shame, Sex, Attraction, Survivor Stories of Conversion Therapy from Jessica Kingsley Publishers. His academic work has appeared in Modern Language Studies, Canadian Jewish Studies, Flannery O'Connor Review, Journal of Jewish Identities, and Studies in American Jewish Literature. His public-facing writing has appeared in The Advocate, Queerty, LGBTQ Nation, and Religion Dispatches, among other venues. On this episode, we mostly discuss his work writing and editing in Shame, Sex, Attraction, Survivor Stories of Conversion Therapy. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you enjoy my conversation with Dr. Lucas Wilson. Dr. Lucas Wilson, welcome to Classical Ideas.
All right, thanks so much for having me.
I'm delighted that you're here. I'm wondering if we can kick this off by having you just introduce yourself a little bit to the audience out there so they know just a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Yeah, so my name is Luke or Lucas Wilson, whichever you prefer. It really doesn't matter to me. I am a SSHRC Postdoctoral Fellow at University of Toronto Mississauga, formerly the Justice, Equity, and Transformation Postdoc at University of Calgary. My research mostly focuses at this point on the new Christian right, white Christian nationalism, and specifically focusing on gender and sexuality, and more particularly on conversion practices, or what has traditionally been understood or referred to as conversion therapy. But my past research was actually mostly in Holocaust studies, looking largely at the intergenerational transmission of trauma between Holocaust survivors, their kids, and their grandkids. I'm a Canadian scholar. Yeah, that's pretty much who I am at this point, at least professionally.
Wonderful. I want to know a little bit about that transition between writing about Holocaust studies into more of the stuff that you're doing now, because I see that you're the author of a book called At Home with the Holocaust from Rutgers Press in 2025. So you have a really recent book in that field, but tell me a little bit about, where you were and then making that jump over to what you're doing now.
Yeah, so this will come out, later on as well, but I am a former evangelical. It was, we oftentimes refer to ourselves as ex-evangelicals. And so I made the really wise decision of attending Liberty University in Lynchburg, Virginia. There's more to say about the name Lynchburg, but we'll put a pin in that for now. And so I went there in all of my, sort of religious zeal as a young evangelical when I graduated high school. And it was there that I actually was first introduced to Holocaust literature, and specific or more broadly Jewish literature. And so, at that point in my life, I had gone through the Canadian public education system, and we had, talked about the Holocaust, of course, in the history courses, but we were never sort of exposed, at least in my high school, to personalized accounts of the Holocaust. I know a lot of other folks, read Wiesel's Night or Primo Levi's work or whatnot, and Frank, but I had never had that experience. And so reading, Holocaust literature in that course for me pushed me, I was sort of like dumbfounded by it, because again, when you learn about it in a historical sense, you learn about facts, figures, dates, places, whatever, but I didn't have that sort of personalized, individualized account. And so I remember sitting in the class being like, what the hell? Or at the time I would have said, what the heck? Sort of blown away by specifically Wiesel's Night. And so I decided that I wanted to do my master's thesis on that, on the book when I graduated. And so I eventually did. I wrote on Wiesel's Night as well as a Canadian Holocaust text when I went to McMaster University back in Ontario, the province I'm from. And after that, I thought to myself, I'm not even sort of scratching the surface of the topic, and I wanted to understand, sort of different aspects of the Holocaust. And so I decided that I wanted to go on and do, another master's in theological studies. And really, my master's in theological studies was like a master's in religion. It wasn't so much theology. It was like theology light. I took literally one course in theology. The rest were sort of religious studies, like, sociology of religion, religion and literature, blah, 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 that kind of stuff. So it was also a time, and we can talk more about this later, when I was deconstructing my faith, or at that time, sort of restructuring my faith, or understanding my faith in light of my sexuality. But that's, again, we'll put a pin in that for now. So at the time, I decided that I wanted to do another master's thesis, and that was on Nazi propaganda. So looking at it from a different, obviously a very different angle. And while I was at Vanderbilt doing my master's, it was there that I took a class on the children of Holocaust survivors. And that for me was fascinating because of, I recognized that intergenerational transmission of trauma in my own life, not obviously to ever compare myself to a child of Holocaust survivors. My experience is very different, but my mom does struggle with mental health. And so seeing a lot of sort of resonances and sort of similarities between how trauma manifests itself in the home and how trauma manifests itself in my home. My mom was a hoarder. Like, you've ever seen the show Hoarders? Like, that was my childhood. And so seeing that remembering that, and then also seeing again how trauma was sort of like registered within the home, and if we can understand the home as an archive of individuals' lives. I said, wait a second, I see some similarities. And again, in no way saying that my experience was, the exact same, or in a lot of ways even, or on par. It was just, there were certain similarities, certain resonances. And so for me, I was fascinated with these folks, and I was like, I want to research more about this intergenerational transmission of trauma, in some ways to understand myself better, but also really because the topic just sort of captivated me. And so I decided that I wanted to do my PhD dissertation on the topic, in which I eventually did. And the book that came out by from Rutgers is an edited version of my dissertation. And so that dissertation, I look at representations of survivor family homes, and looking at the home as an archive of trauma, and looking at how different children of survivors talk about the home and represent the home. And so that for me was how I got into Holocaust studies, and eventually the area that I focused on. But I was also doing work in looking at how Christian theology laid the seedbed for the Holocaust, looking at sort of the antecedents as well as what came after. And all of these topics were fascinating to me. But when I was doing my PhD dissertation, one of my committee members, my entire committee was Jewish. One of my committee members said to me, "Mook, no one cares about Jews anymore." That was like, oh shoot. What do I say to that? What do I do in light of, if in fact this, is true within the academy, what he's saying? And, I think from my experience, I think that in part I can understand what he's saying, that, at this point, Jewish literature is not considered ethnic literature. It's considered white literature by and large. And I don't actually agree with, how it's sort of conceptualized today. However, I'm not the one making hiring decisions when, when I'm applying for jobs. And so because I had this focus, and this very specific focus on Jewish literature, and then even more specifically on Holocaust literature, I thought to myself, well, I need to pivot a little bit academically and professionally. I need to expand what I'm doing. And so for me, I'm always going to be fascinated with Holocaust literature and Holocaust studies more generally. That topic I've not lost interest. It's just that for now, in some ways, I put that sort of on the back burner, although I'm doing a few projects in relation to the Holocaust. But again, that's putting that aside. Really, what's taken sort of center stage for me is white Christian nationalism. And, obviously these are two very different topics, but methodologically and also theoretically, I approach both topics quite similarly. By way of, if I'm thinking about the theory that undergirds my research in both areas, trauma theory, memory studies, affect theory, certainly informs both of my approaches to both topics. But also methodologically, I use literature, I use oral history, I use archival evidence to look at these different topics. And so for me, white Christian nationalism and looking at the new Christian right, that also comes from a place of biography, right? That I was an evangelical for many years, about 13-ish years. I am no longer, I'm not a person of faith at this point, but I'm still heavily invested in these conversations. And so for me, it's I think that there are a number of similarities, obviously like huge differences, right? That these are not the same topics in many ways, but there are, I think, parallels and a number of, intriguing connections between the two, between queerness and, trauma and, refugee experiences and experiences on the margin. right? All these different experiences, and looking at how folks deal with these different things in their childhood, in their adolescence, and ultimately in their adulthood. So for me, again, quite different, content wise, but at the same time, a number of commonalities that run through all of my work on these topics.
Yeah, well, I think it's really cool that you're in a couple of different fields because, like, what if I was you and I had these different areas of interest, I would see that I had an entire career ahead of me that was fulfilling and rich, in which at any point I could pivot into something and take on a new project where my heart was leading me instead of being pigeonholed only into one thing. So actually, I think it's really exciting to see that you're in these two different fields kind of simultaneously. It's pretty cool.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I love it because I mean, like for me, like I mean, a few things. One, I think that the topic of the children of the topic of children of Holocaust survivors and also their grandchildren is not completely. There's like so much research to be done. The other thing is for white Christian nationalists, like they give us so much material, right? Like every single day, look at the current administration of the U.S., right? And it's horrible in so many ways, right? Like, and specifically when we're talking about gender and sexuality, which is again my focus within that field, they give us too much material. And again, this is like the lived experiences of so many people that I think is uh it's awful what these folks have done and what they're doing and what they'll continue to do. However, as an academic, there's never going to be they've given us so much material to work with that I think, if I can find a permanent position down the road. Right now, again, I'm a postdoc. I think that I'll have a full career ahead of me with that area alone, in addition to, like you said, the other area of research. So
Well, let's talk about a book that you and I have come together to chat about a little bit. It's an anthology called Shame, Sex, Attraction from Jessica Kingsley Publishers. I'm loving this book. I've read probably 75 pages of it at this point, which is good for me considering I read like so many different people's projects for this podcast. Getting through a lot of that is it's impressive for me. I just want to say, how did this anthology start coming together on your end as the editor?
yeah, so this was back when Twitter was alive, and so I got a message on in my DMs from this editor. And of course, for those of us in the academic world, like this never happens. And I thought it was a scam. I thought that, someone was like, I don't know, going to try to, push predatory publishing on me and say like, hey, here's an opportunity, and then make me pay for it. But it didn't turn out to be a scam. This message I received from this editor from this press, JKP, Jessica Kingsley Publishers. And the editor said, hey, I've been tracking your work, my public facing work, for a while now, and we think that you might be the person to put together this anthology of stories about conversion therapy survivors, and their experiences in conversion therapy. And so I looked up the press, I looked up the editor. Turns out both were legitimate. Responded back, said, hey, let's chat. So we did, and with a little bit of back and forth about what exactly they were looking for and what I would be interested in pursuing, edited collection wise. I got a contract and started, soliciting chapters from survivors themselves. And so every single story included in the collection, there are 17 stories, including my own, plus a foreword by Garrett Conley, the author of Boy Erased. All of these stories and Garrett's, forward, all the authors are survivors themselves. And I thought that was really important because, there have been some recent representations of conversion therapy that have not been written by survivors, and as of recent, and sort of like, imaginative, fictional depictions of what folks imagine to be conversion practices. And I said, that's not what I want. I want survivors' voices to be centered. And so that's really how the collection came together. And then, obviously the drafting and the back and forth between me and contributors, however long that took, several months, and then the polishing. And then it finally came out this January, and the book has now sort of, ventured out into the world, which is a wild sort of experience because this is my first public facing as opposed to academic publication, other than, small articles or short articles that I've written in the past. And so it's exciting. And I'm super, happy with the way that it turned out. And I think that there are a number of voices in there that are super powerful.
Yeah, well, you handled the introduction, and it's wonderful because it does a nice deep dive into conversion therapy. And for people who, haven't read the book, I would obviously encourage anyone to check out the book as well. But I'm wondering if you can give a crash course in what you think people need to know about the history of conversion therapy and how it emerges in society.
Yeah, so conversion therapy, or more broadly, conversion practices, first came about in actually secular context, particularly in medical and psychiatric contexts. And so, middle of the 1800s, right? The words heterosexual, homosexual come into the common or modern lexicon. Theretofore, they had not existed. And then, of course, once we have language to describe or to name certain, phenomena, we oftentimes start thinking about these different, words and also what they represent. And so people started theorizing what exactly is homosexual, what is heterosexual. And obviously, quite quickly, folks pathologized homosexuality. And so, with these different sort of understandings of homosexuality that were, of course, negative, people started trying to figure out, okay, how do we fix this? How do we change this? And so conversion practices, began. Not to say that there weren't some before, but again, this is sort of a more modern history, or sort of recent history. So what we find at different contexts, whether they be medical or psychiatric or psychological, are people trying to change or fix people. And so, anything from medical castration to, talk therapy and beyond, right, aversion therapy, whatever, these different practices sort of come into existence. And again, these different contexts are trying to fix or cure the problem. And so all of this is really happening in secular context. But then, once we fast forward all the way to the 70s, again, this is a really gross general overview. And I apologize for, not stopping for more detail. But once we get to the 70s, this is when Christians make their way into the scene. And again, there had been practices, up until this point, attempting to change individuals' gender identities, sexual orientations, and gender expressions. But Christians really sort of amplify these efforts. And what we see also, of course, is that by the 70s, a lot of these efforts in secular context start slowing down. Not to say they stopped, because they still continued and continue till today, but Christians really take over the reins. And so 70s hit, Southern California, we have our first ex-gay group. Of course, there was an ex-gay movement, or sort of nascent movement, I should say, out in Australia. But in the US, if we're talking about North America, the US is, it starts out in California. And these different groups start cropping up. What we find is that by 1976, this is when Exodus is formed, the largest, what becomes the largest ex-gay international, organization. And so with Exodus, 1976, it forms. This starts, again, sort of snowballing and becoming bigger and bigger. And efforts to change individuals in ecclesial or religious contexts really sort of pick up steam. 80s into the 90s, we start finding that, again, like sort of the height of the ex-gay movement, and again, efforts to change people. This is also when psychological approaches are married with the spiritual approaches. So in the 70s, what we found with conversion practices, and by and large, in the 70s, we find that, again, most approaches to conversion, or most conversion practices really are theological, right? Really relying on the salvific power of Jesus to help individuals overcome their same-sex attraction. In the 80s, this is when they start, finding or purchase in psychological explanations of homosexuality. And these are like pseudo-Freudian crackpot theories by Christian psychologists. If we can be so generous with the term psychologist to describe these people. But what happens is that the ex-gay movement really latches onto these psychological understandings of homosexuality, or approaches to treating homosexuality. And then these Christian psychologists or researchers, quote unquote, really latch onto the ex-gay movement. What the former finds is, legitimacy by way of the quote unquote research being produced by these, Christian psychologists and researchers. What the Christian psychologists and researchers find is that they get money from these ex-gay organizations that are paying them to come for conferences or speaking engagements, or who are buying their books. So they form this symbiotic relationship, and it really, again, picks up steam in these into the 90s. Once we get into the 2000s, and also even before that, we're finding more and more ex-gay leaders, leaders of this movement, who are dropping off because they're like, well, this doesn't work. It's all a sham. And, we've been lying for years. 2013, Exodus International closes. This does not mean that conversion therapy ends. In fact, a lot of, sub-organizations splinter off and do their own thing. And there had been a number of, sister organizations throughout Exodus's history. But really, until today, when we're thinking about conversion therapy, we're finding a lot of these practices are happening behind closed doors. A lot of them happened behind closed doors before, but they were advertised before. Now they're not so much advertised. These are really happening in church context now. Perhaps the most public organization, ex-gay organization, is the Changed movement out of Redding, California, Bethel. Their organization, the Change movement, that they promote these ex-gay narratives as if they're still happening. And of course, we know that they're not. We know that these people are really bad actors, but they are actors nonetheless, claiming to have changed their sexualities or their genders to align with the heteronormative model. So this is a brief overview. Again, there's a lot more nuance involved in all of this, but that's to give you a general overview of what we're talking about when we're talking about conversion therapy.
Fabulous. Another one of my favorite things about your chapter is that it talks about all the terminology, right? Reparative change, reintegrative, reorientation therapy, and more. What is the purpose of this huge variety of terminology for the groups that are doing these types of things?
Yeah, so these different terms that are being used are it's euphemistic language to cover over what they're doing, right? Like to say that I'm practicing conversion therapy in 2025 is not like a cute look for a lot of these folks, right? And so they're not going to want to say, oh, we practice conversion therapy again in several countries, in several states, in several municipalities. This is illegal. And so for them, they have to find other ways of saying what they do without saying what they do, because if they are explicit, then of course they can be in hot water for what they're doing. So to call it reintegrative therapy or gender exploration therapy, whatever, I mean, it's euphemistic language to cover over the fact that that they're practicing conversion therapy. What we find, and these are perhaps the more like scientific sounding names. There's also what we find in a lot of churches, specifically in conversion practices today, happen disproportionately in Christian conservative Christian contexts. Like the vast majority of conversion practices are happening in Christian contexts. Not all, but again, the vast majority. But what we'll find oftentimes too is that we'll find churches referring to conversion practices as pastoral counseling or biblical counseling or biblical worldview counseling, whatever they want, whatever dog whistle they want to use. For those of us who have our ear to the ground, we know exactly what they're talking about. When they're talking about, say, pastoral counseling and it's in reference to gender or sexuality, 99.9% of the time, they're talking about conversion therapy without saying it, right? And so these folks know that the optics are not good to call that, to call what they're doing conversion therapy. We also know that in some cases, what they're doing is illegal. Not everywhere, because again, conversion practices happen in a number of contexts where there are no laws in place. However, they have gone underground and they've done their best to sort of obfuscate the dirty work that they're doing by using this, different language or terminology to hide the practices the different practices that they're using or attempting to use to change individual sexual orientations or gender identities and expressions.
Gotcha. Okay, so you write in the chapter that conversion therapy can be subtle and it can be blatant. And I'm wondering if you can just give me an example or two of something very subtle and something very blatant that we might see.
For instance, maybe what's more blatant, I can drop on my own experience. I went to Liberty University, and all 4 years of my time there, I was in the conversion therapy program. They had both an individual program and a one-on-one program, and also a group therapy program. And so I was in both, although I only went to the group once. And the story that we have in same-sex attraction is my time in the group. But I went to the one-on-one program all 4 years, and that's what I'll be writing about for my next collection. In the one-on-one program, I remember specifically, and this was said to me multiple times, that my conversion therapist, his name was Dane Emmerich, Pastor Dane Emmerich. He would always tell me, "You're like, Luke, you're not gay." That's like the writing's on the wall, like the proof's in the pudding, sir. But at the time, I also believed that I wasn't as well. He would oftentimes say, like, "You're not gay, you're a child of God," as if those two things are mutually exclusive. And again, today I'm not a person of faith, and I have no desire to be, committed in any one way religiously. I don't even identify as spiritual at this point. However, at the time, I certainly thought that I had to choose between being gay and being a Christian. So this, when we're talking about, subtle and blatant forms of conversion therapy, this is, of course, a blatant form of conversion therapy. I was told I was not gay. I was told instead I struggled with same-sex attraction, which is a way of divorcing the identity, i.e. someone's sexual orientation, from the individual, him or herself or themselves. And so again, I'm not gay, you just struggle with same-sex attraction. Eventually you're going to find, a woman, you just need to work hard enough, whether it be praying or, acting like a man, because over time, if you act like a man, you're not just going to act like a man, you're going to become a man. And of course, part of that understanding of what it means to be a quote unquote man was this essentialist understanding of heterosexuality, right? That all real men are straight and all not real men are gay. And so this, of course, is a blatant form of conversion therapy. Now, if we're talking about conversion practices more generally, and we're talking about perhaps more subtle versions of or subtle instances of conversion practices, this is something as simple as a parent saying to his or her or their child, don't sit like that. You look like a sissy. Don't you can't play with the trap because you're a girl. You can't wear that because you look like a boy. Whatever, right? This is messaging that queer folks receive over their entire lifetime, right? And I say now that not every single queer person went through conversion therapy, but every single queer person has experienced conversion practices, right? All of us growing up when we were kids, we were told one way, in one way or another, whether it be from parents or teachers or religious leaders or guardians or friends or whatever, we were told, don't do that, do this, whatever, right? So it's this messaging that accumulates over time, and over time is builds up, and it really, again, we queer kids notice it, obviously, because we are constantly reminded that we don't fit the mold. We do not align with what it means to be, we don't align with the heteronormative model. And again, some people align more closely, and a lot of us don't. And so when we hear this messaging, and when we did hear this messaging, it of course it impacts who we are and how we understand ourselves. And so that would be a more subtle, although it's of course not subtle for those of us who experience it, conversion practice.
Gotcha. So the alleged intended outcome for conversion therapy or conversion practices is obviously to make heterosexuality the intended outcome, right?
By and large, and if we're talking about sexual orientation, sometimes, or when we're talking about trans folks or non-binary folks or genderqueer folks, the intended outcome would be gender normativity. But a lot of the time, yes, we're talking about sexual orientation being straight.
So what is in the actual outcome? What actually happens psychologically in practice in the end? Like, what is the result of people who have gone through conversion practices and conversion therapy? What actually happens to these people who go through these experiences?
Yeah, so I oftentimes say now that you shouldn't have to go to therapy after going through quote unquote therapy, right? Like conversion therapy, of course, is a misnomer. Is there's no conversion involved and there's no therapy involved. And I always feel like I have to put quotation marks around everything when I talk about, gender and sexuality and evangelical or white Christian fundamentalist context. But when we're talking about conversion therapy, yeah, the outcome is of course no changed orientation, no changed gender identity or expression. Maybe expression changes in the sense that, generate expression changes because we're made to act, we're made to perform. So that I think perhaps can change, and maybe even how people understand themselves. There's oftentimes this idea that like for those who are like, for instance, in the changed movement, or for those who think that conversion therapy or claim that conversion therapy works, they know that it didn't work, and they know just as well as the rest of us know it didn't work. But they'll oftentimes say, "Oh, my identity is not this." So their sexual orientation identity or their gender identity might change in the sense that they say that they, don't identify as such. But of course, the rest of us know it's not true. So in that sense, that's what they might claim that they've changed. But again, we've never seen anyone change. And for the most people who do say that they changed, by the end of their lives or within a few years, they'll come back and say, you know what, this was all a lie. It's like, yeah, duh. Anyway, back to normal sort of life, if we can even call normal life after conversion therapy. But I think that when we're talking about the consequences, like what are the actual outcomes, not changed orientation or gender identity, what the consequences are oftentimes are negative, right? When there was a recent Canadian study that identified shame as the number one outcome of conversion practices. We find for a lot of folks who've undergone conversion therapy or have experienced conversion practices, we find increased rates of homelessness. We find increased rates of mental health issues. We find depression, anxiety, guilt, shame, increased rates of suicidal ideation, negative impacts on individuals' ability to relate to themselves, to the divine, if we're talking about spiritual consequences, or others, distrust of the queer community or queer communities. There are a whole host of consequences that we find in. They're all negative, right? Like there is no positive outcome from conversion therapy. It's just a concentrated version of homophobia and or transphobia, just in a very specific space when folks undergo conversion practices.
Yeah, I think that the overwhelming consensus for people who see the reality of these things is that they are bad. And so I think that there's been some banning of these practices around the world. I'm wondering if you know of any places where it's like still legal, where it's like illegal, where there's like a little gray area between some of it is legal, some of it is illegal. I'm wondering if you can tell me about the legality of it, of what you know around the world.
Yeah, so there are a number of places where it is illegal, right? If we're talking about a nationwide ban, we can of course think of Canada. Canada, it was only a few years ago that we finally banned it nationwide, and it's not just uh, for minors. Oftentimes, what we find, at least in the U.S. context, is that when there are statewide or municipal bans, there are bans only protecting children, which is a great first start, right? But it's certainly not where this needs to end. What we need to find is are nationwide bans that ban conversion practices for anyone and everyone. And I think that oftentimes what you find with people who push against that idea is, and sometimes even from like more progressively minded folks, which I think is just a wild idea when people, if you just stop and think about it, it's not that difficult to understand. I say now that, if we're talking about conversion practices, we're talking about abuse, right? This is psychological, spiritual, in some cases, physical abuse if we're talking about electroshock therapy. And so we're talking about abuse. And if we are to take seriously what the UN Rapporteur, I believe in 2019, referred to as torture, i.e., conversion practices, for anyone who wants to say, shouldn't we allow this if people want it? It's like, no one should be able to consent to abuse. No one should be able to consent to torture. What the hell are you talking about, right? Like, it's such a wild idea that people have. And so what we find in the places where it is illegal for only children, again, that's a great first step, but it's certainly not the end. Um, and even if we are to think about, Canada having a nationwide ban, there is there's a lot of work to be done. And in fact, there's a few, sort of seminars that are going to be happening this year about the next steps, because we know that conversion practices still happen in Canada despite this nationwide ban. That again, this is really going on behind closed doors, particularly church doors. And so far, no one has brought forth a case about, an organization persisting in conversion efforts. And so, what do we do when we, again, know that there are instances of conversion therapy happening? We don't want to set a bad legal precedent where someone says, hey, this church over here, and there's actually a church in Toronto that's like a few blocks from my apartment that I know, this Catholic church that still offers conversion practices, conversion therapy. I know that it offers conversion therapy. And so, with that being said, how do we address this, right? And so, I think that the trepidation at this point is, we don't want to set a bad legal precedent by saying, oh, so and so is doing this, and then sort of pursuing the case and then losing. So I think that's really sort of the issue. But again, there are several countries throughout the world. There are several municipalities, or sorry, hundreds of municipalities across the world, and obviously several states and provinces in different countries that have also banned it. And I think at this point in the US, we're talking 25 plus states. Of course, the biggest news sort of recently within the US is that the US Supreme Court has decided that they will hear a case regarding conversion practices in the state of Colorado. And what's going to happen, we're sort of expecting, is that, it's not going to go well, and that this conversion therapist is going to win, just given the way that the Supreme Court is stacked. And so that case will be heard likely at the end of this year or early into next. And they're actually bringing forth a really weird argument, I think, because I think it's just one of the, to put it academically, one of the stupidest arguments they could bring forth. But again, the way that the Supreme Court is stacked doesn't really matter how they're arguing it. And that is on the basis of free speech, that this conversion therapist is saying, well, I should have free speech and I should be able to say what I want to say in regards to my religious convictions when practicing quote unquote therapy. Which is crazy, because every single, not every single, but most professional organizations have a code of conduct that say, regardless of your religious beliefs, you can't say certain things. If you're a medical doctor, you can't say, well, I can't spew racist drivel. Of course you can, right? And that should, never be allowed. In the same way, one should not be allowed to use homophobic or transphobic rhetoric, or again, homophobic or transphobic practices when treating patients. And so that's what we're going to see later this year in the context of the U.S.
Well, I think that that'll be a really, rich conversation for you to be engaged in. I hope that you'll be doing a lot of writing when that Supreme Court case is around. so that people can keep up to date with it, especially me. So are there any organizations out there doing really good work involved in the fight against conversion practices that listeners could look up and follow along with if they wanted to know more about how they can personally get involved?
So in Canada, there was a really great organization, but now because it's banned, they've sort of disbanded a little bit. No, they still do a little bit of work, but my friend Nick from No Conversion Canada was just a fabulous organization. Again, there's less of a need for this organization today, and other folks have sort of picked up the reins. And so the folks who have picked up the reins are in Canada specifically are the Community-Based Research Center. These folks are fabulous, and they've been doing a lot of work. Specifically, the person who's responsible for a lot of this work is Jordan Sullivan, who's actually one of the contributors in the book. And Jordan and the CBRC and also Egal Canada and other organizations, they've been really doing, fighting the good fight. But what next? What do we do now that conversion therapy is banned? In the States, Wayne Beeson at Truth Wins Out, he's fantastic. He does a lot of really fabulous coverage of conversion practices and challenges to the legality of conversion practices. And so he's someone I would definitely be looking at. As in addition to that, there are some other organizations that are quite prominent, but I have some, I think that they don't do a lot of like actual work when it comes to supporting survivors and also really fighting against conversion practices. So I'll leave it there. I'll say that Wayne Beeson in the US is really the person to have, to look out for.
Awesome. Do you want to shout out any of the other people that are in the book and contributed?
I'm really happy that I was able to include not only, established authors like, of course, Garrett Conley, New York Times bestseller, who wrote the foreword, but also emerging writers and also some folks who haven't had really much writing experience in the past. And so there's a wide range of people's, writing histories. However, I would say that all the stories included are just fantastic. And it was so much fun to actually work with these folks on their stories as we went through the drafting process. Nathan Z is someone who comes to mind. He is one of the contributors, the only contributor who comes from what he describes as a Chinese call. And so Nathan's story is unbelievably beautifully written. And he uses a lot of repetition. And he goes on throughout the story to talk about what he didn't write in his autofiction novel, what he didn't write. And he gives all these different moments throughout his life of things that he just didn't write about in his autofiction novel. And this sort of repetition, it picks up this pace and it almost feels quite suffocating. It feels, as you're reading, sort of this intense sort of affective, emotional, palpable response. And you feel like you can't breathe in some ways that, again, it is this suffocating sort of feeling that you have when you're reading it. And so I think that Nathan's work, again, is just so beautifully written and so sobering, but also Nathan has a new contract for I believe it actually is his autofiction novel that's coming out. So he writes about what he didn't write in that, but then his new book will be published soon. So I would say that's a shout out there to Nathan. What I'll also say is that, and again, also Jordan Sullivan and the work that he's been doing is just fantastic at the CBRC. But in addition to all this, I do have one person, actually it's two people, whose work I always draw upon when I write about conversion therapy. And they're included in the introduction multiple times because their work, I just always draw upon it. And that's the work of Christine Robinson and Sue Speedy. They wrote, I think perhaps for me, the most memorable piece that they've written, and again, a piece that I bring up, and I bring it up explicitly in the introduction, is the article Genocidal Intentions. And genocidal intentions in the article, what they argue is that conversion practices at their core are motivated by genocidal intentions. And, some people, might at first blush sort of think that that's, a histrionic or dramatic sort of argument. But when we think about it, if we think about conversion practitioners, and we think perhaps more broadly of the, many evangelical churches and, white Christian fundamentalist churches, if these folks could have their way, queers would not exist, right? That queer joy, queer love, queer representation, queer community, queers would not exist. their desire is for us to be gone. And that is definitionally motivated by genocidal intentions, right? That, and we know that, genocide is not always physical, that it can be and oftentimes is cultural. And so this is certainly these are two folks, again, Robinson and Spivey, whose work I really want to emphasize and promote because they are so fantastic and they've shaped the way that I approach this topic so deeply.
Awesome. Well, we got to shout out Sacred Rights a little bit too. You're a part of this training cohort recently, and you already publish public scholarship widely. I mean, this book is an example of public scholarship, same-sex attraction, but you've also been in The Advocate, you've been in LGBTQ Nation, you've been in Religion Dispatches. What have you gained from this specific training process to become a more public-facing scholar when you're already doing so much?
You know what? I think that it allowed me, up until this point, I've done, again, like you said, I've written a few articles on the topic mostly of conversion therapy and Liberty University more broadly. But I didn't really know what the heck I was doing. I was just like, let me tell the story. And initially, when I first wrote my first article for Queerty, the reason why I wrote it really was to separate myself from Liberty, because at that point I was, again, researching Jewish literature, and it's not a good look to say, oh, I went to Liberty University and you're working in Jewish studies, right? They're all, it's sort of suspect. Oftentimes, evangelicals are understood as philo-Semites. Why? Because they are. And so I didn't want to have that reputation. So I was like, okay, I'm going to write this piece of public scholarship and separate myself from Liberty and say, like, I'm not one of them. I'm not one of them. And then that sort of snowballed into a number of other opportunities, which, ultimately resulted in same-sex attraction. But the thing is that when I was doing these different, when I was writing these different articles, I had no flippant idea what I was doing. I was just sort of writing and hoping for the best, drawing upon the academic training that I had. But of course, public facing writing is qualitatively different. And so I was just sort of guessing this is what I should do. With Sacred Rights, I think that it gave me a much clearer idea as to what exactly or how to approach these different, op-eds or explainers, and even the difference between an op-ed and an explainer, right? These different sorts of genres that theretofore I hadn't sort of considered. And so I'm super grateful for this Sacred Rights, training, because it offered me, again, a clearer idea about how to write these different pieces, and to hook with something that's happened more recently in the media as a way to begin your piece. This is something that, again, I probably should have known this, but I certainly didn't. I learned this, and so I'm super grateful for it. And then also how to mobilize your work by way of social media, and risks associated with public scholarship. Again, I obviously knew the rewards, and in a lot of ways I knew the responsibilities, but I certainly didn't understand the risks until I asked some questions like, why shouldn't I, say, tag someone who's like super prominent in the white Christian fundamentalist or white Christian nationalist sort of movement? What risks are associated with doing that, right? That there might be a number of trolls who will come after you, and realizing that they can really do a lot. And that, to me, again, I just hadn't sort of like considered these potential pitfalls when not just writing these pieces, but then again engaging with these communities about whom I write. So I think these were super helpful ways of or things that I learned as I was going through the training.
Fabulous. Well, Luke, where can people find you if they want to follow along with your work?
Yeah, so I'm on Instagram at Luke Slam Dunk Wilson. I'm on Blue Sky at Luke Slam Dunk Wilson. I'm on Threads at Luke Slam Dunk Wilson. And I try to keep it super consistent on Twitter. I'm at Wilson_FW. So I sort of failed in that regard. But Twitter, again, like, she's dead. But otherwise, on LinkedIn, Lucas Wilson. On Facebook, Luke Wilson. I post most of my work that's academic on academia.edu. But otherwise, yeah, those are the main social media platforms I'm on. And then my book is available in the US on bookshop.org. It's also available through Barnes & Noble, but bookshop.org, you can support local bookstores in Canada, but available at Indigo. And then elsewhere in the world, I won't get into the specifics just because I'm assuming that most folks who listen to this are North American based.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Luke Wilson, thank you so much for coming on Classical Ideas and telling me about your work and this fantastic anthology that is brand new, as well as a little bit about at home with the Holocaust. I appreciated the journey between the two projects as well. Kind of ties your work together and tells your life story kind of all in the same go. So I appreciate you being here. Thank you so much for coming on Classical Ideas.
Thank you so much for having me, Greg. I really appreciate it.